We humans, we spend so much of our time trying to figure things out, don't we? Like, what's it all about? What's our purpose? It can feel, well, huge, this massive quest without any clear map.
Absolutely. It's fundamental. And, in psychotherapy, there have been some really key figures who've tackled this head on. They offer these fascinating, quite different ways of looking at that search for meaning.
Right, which leads us perfectly into today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We're going to explore the work of three, well, giants in the field. Each one gives us a unique lens on this. Carl Rogers, Irvin Yalom, and Viktor Frankl.
Exactly. So you've got Carl Rogers, a central figure in humanistic psychology. He really emphasized our inner drive to grow, this sort of natural push to become our fullest selves.
Yeah.
And he stressed how vital a supportive, accepting environment is for that.
Okay. Then there's Irvin Yalom. He takes a more existential path, right? Doesn't shy away from the tough stuff.
Not at all. He looks squarely at what he calls the ultimate concerns, things like, well, death, freedom, isolation, the possibility that life doesn't have a built-in meaning.
Heavy stuff.
It can be. And then Viktor Frankl. His own experiences surviving the Holocaust were incredibly formative for his ideas. He developed logotherapy, centered on this concept of the will to meaning, the idea that our deepest motivation is actually to find purpose, even when things are incredibly difficult.
Wow. Okay, so our mission today is to really unpack these different views. How do these ideas about human nature actually shape the way a therapist works with a client? How does it change that relationship? And what different routes do they suggest for, understanding mental health, finding meaning?
And we'll definitely look at the sort of pros and cons of each approach too, how they might apply to life generally and specifically to mental health challenges.
Great. So let's start with Carl Rogers, the optimistic path, as you called it.
Yeah, Rogers had this fundamentally hopeful view. He truly believed that inside every person there's this innate tendency towards growth, towards becoming more complete. Self-actualization, he called it. Think of like an acorn. It just knows how to become an oak tree if it gets the sun and water it needs. Rogers saw people in a similar way.
And for Rogers, those right conditions, they weren't sun and water, but specific things in therapy.
Exactly. He identified 3 core conditions the therapist needs to provide. Empathy, really deeply understanding the client's world, genuineness, being authentic and real in the relationship, and unconditional positive regard.
Unconditional positive regard. So like complete acceptance no matter what.
Pretty much. Accepting the person completely, without judgment. Rogers believed these conditions create that safe, nurturing space where the person's natural drive to grow can just happen.
So the therapist is more like a facilitator, creating the right climate.
Precisely. Not directing, but facilitating. Allowing that self-actualizing tendency to emerge and guide the process.
Which explains his non-directive method. I mean, he famously avoided giving advice or interpretations, right? It was more about deep listening.
Absolutely. Active listening, reflecting back the client's feelings and meanings. There's this incredible trust in the client's own ability to heal and find their way.
So he really believed the answers are inside the client.
He did. The therapist's job is to help them connect with that inner wisdom. And for Rogers, meaning isn't some external thing you find. It's something you discover internally through being authentic, through expressing yourself honestly, and through genuine relationships.
Okay, so how did he see problems like anxiety or depression fitting into this?
Well, anxiety, for Rogers, often comes from what he called incongruence, like a mismatch between your real, authentic self and the self you think you should be, maybe to please others or fit in.
So there's a gap.
Exactly. And therapy helps bridge that gap, helps you become more congruent, more aligned with who you really are. That naturally reduces the anxiety.
And depression.
He often saw depression as linked to a lack of empathy, a lack of feeling truly understood and supported. The therapeutic relationship itself, offering that core empathy and acceptance, becomes a key part of the healing.
Right, it provides what was missing.
Precisely. And addiction, Rogers might view that as a kind of maladaptive coping strategy, an attempt to deal with underlying emotional pain or that incongruence we talked about. Therapy provides the safe space needed to explore those deeper issues, making the addiction less necessary.
Okay, that framework makes a lot of sense. So
Yeah.
a big positive, a pro for this approach seems to be this real focus on the client's own power, their autonomy, trusting their potential.
Definitely. It's incredibly empowering. The potential downside, though, the con could be that for some people, especially if they're in a real crisis, this non-directive style might feel, well, not directive enough. They might want more explicit guidance.
Sure, I can see that. Okay, so that's Rogers' hopeful view. Let's shift gears now to Irvin Yalom and existential therapy. This sounds like it gets into some deeper, maybe darker territory.
It definitely confronts some of the fundamental, perhaps uncomfortable realities of just being human. Yalom draws heavily on existential philosophers, people like Heidegger, Sartre, who focused on things like freedom, responsibility, and the lack of inherent meaning. So Yalom zeroes in on these ultimate concerns: death, the fact that we will die; freedom, the burden of having choices; isolation, our fundamental separateness; and meaninglessness, the idea that meaning isn't just given to us.
Wow, okay, so quite a contrast to Roger's inherent goodness. Yalom starts with these unavoidable anxieties of existence.
Exactly. And for Yalom, anxiety isn't always pathological. It's often a natural, even necessary signal that we're grappling with these deep truths. Problems arise more when we try to ignore or suppress these existential realities.
So how does therapy look different here? Is the therapist still just facilitating?
Not quite in the same way. The relationship is still vital, absolutely central. But Yalom's approach is generally more directive, more dialogical. The therapist is more active. There's a big emphasis on the here and now, what's actually happening between the client and therapist in the room, exploring transference, those relational patterns.
So less hands-off than Rogers.
Yes. And Yalom might use techniques like looking at dreams or often group therapy. Group therapy is big for Yalom as it directly confronts issues of isolation and relationship. The main goal is helping clients face these existential anxieties openly so they can live more authentically and make conscious choices about their lives.
And meaning, in Yalom's view, if it's not inherent.
It's something you create. It's not found, it's built. Through engaging with life authentically, by embracing your freedom and the responsibility that comes with it and your limitations. It's about making choices aligned with your values, even knowing about death and potential meaninglessness, taking responsibility for crafting your own meaning.
So applying this to anxiety, depression, addiction, how does Yalom see those?
Well, anxiety, as we said, is often seen as an existential signpost, something to be explored, not just eliminated. What is this anxiety telling you about how you're living or what you fear?
Like a wake-up call.
Could be. Depression might stem from not living authentically, from avoiding those big questions, feeling stuck, or that life lacks vitality. Therapy aims to help the person re-engage, purposefully owning their choices.
And addiction.
Yalom might see addiction as an attempt to escape the weight of freedom, or the fear of isolation, or maybe just that existential dread, numbing out. Group therapy, again, can be really powerful here. It breaks down that isolation and forces you into real contact with others and yourself.
Okay, so the strength here, the pro, is that it really tackles these fundamental human issues head-on. And the emphasis on personal responsibility is quite strong.
Hugely empowering for many. It encourages taking ownership. The potential con, the flip side, is that directly confronting things like death, meaninglessness, isolation, that can be really intense. It might feel overwhelming, maybe even frightening for some people, particularly if they're already feeling very fragile.
Yeah, definitely sounds like it requires a certain readiness. Okay, let's move to our third perspective. Viktor Frankl and logotherapy. The focus here shifts firmly to meaning, right? Stemming from his own life experiences.
Absolutely. Frankl's time in Nazi concentration camps was, unimaginable, but it profoundly shaped his ideas. He saw firsthand that people who had a reason to live, some purpose or meaning they clung to, had a much better chance of surviving. This led him to believe that the most fundamental human drive isn't for pleasure, like Freud thought, or power, like Adler suggested, but actually this deep will to meaning.
And that famous quote encapsulates it so well. Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how.
Exactly. It highlights the incredible resilience that comes from having a sense of purpose, even in the worst circumstances.
So logotherapy, his approach, is all about helping people find that why.
Precisely. And his method is often more structured, more goal-oriented than the other two we've discussed. He used techniques like Socratic dialogue, asking questions to help clients clarify their own values and potential meanings. He also developed specific techniques like de-reflection.
De-reflection, what's that?
It's about shifting focus away from yourself and your problems and towards engaging in meaningful activities or connecting with others. Getting out of your own head, essentially. And attitude modification, focusing on the power we have to choose our attitude, even towards suffering we can't avoid, finding meaning in how we face challenges.
So the therapist is more of a guide in this model, helping uncover meaning.
Yes, very much a guide, a companion in that search, helping the client identify their specific pathways to meaning.
And Frankl brought in a spiritual dimension too, didn't he? Not necessarily religious, but spiritual.
He did. He believed there's a kind of spiritual dimension to human existence, a sense that life might have a deeper purposefulness, an underlying meaning we can connect with. Even if it's not tied to organized religion, there's this sense of something beyond the purely material.
Okay, so how did Frankl connect anxiety, depression, and addiction to this lack of meaning?
Well, he coined the term neurogenic neurosis for anxiety or distress that arises specifically from a perceived lack of meaning in life. So finding or creating meaning directly addresses this type of anxiety.
Makes sense.
And depression, he often linked to what he called the existential vacuum, that feeling of emptiness, boredom, purposelessness. Logotherapy tackles this head on by helping people discover meaning. This could be through creative work, through love and relationships, or as mentioned, through finding dignity and purpose even in unavoidable suffering.
And addiction,
Yeah.
following the pattern.
Yes, Frankl would likely argue addiction often stems from that same existential vacuum. Substances become a substitute, a way to fill the void where genuine meaning should be. Finding a compelling why, a real purpose, reduces the need for that substitute.
So a definite pro here is this incredibly powerful focus on meaning and purpose as motivators. That seems like a huge strength for resilience.
Absolutely. It offers a strong sense of direction and hope. The potential con, however, is that for someone already struggling, feeling lost or depressed, the emphasis on finding meaning could, ironically, feel like more pressure.
Like another thing they're failing at.
Exactly. It could potentially feel like a burden rather than a source of liberation, if not handled sensitively.
That's a really crucial point. Okay, we've unpacked the three approaches. Let's try and compare them more directly now, especially thinking about how their different views of human nature really play out in the therapist-client relationship.
Okay, well, the starting point is how they see the client, fundamentally. Rogers. Inherently good, growth-oriented, Yalom. Grappling with harsh existential realities, Frankl. Primarily a seeker of meaning.
And that core view must completely shape what the therapist actually does.
Completely. For Rogers, the therapist is a facilitator, creating the safe space, the right conditions. For Yalom, the therapist is more like a fellow traveler, maybe a bit provocative, engaging directly with those difficult existential themes, a confronter sometimes. And for Frankl, the therapist is more of a guide, actively helping the client search for and identify their unique sources of meaning.
It also feels like they focus on different points in time, past, present, future.
That's a great observation. Rogers is very focused on the present therapeutic relationship as the engine for future growth. What happens now between therapist and client unlocks potential. Yalom is also very present focused, particularly on the here and now of the therapy session, but always with those ultimate, timeless, existential concerns looming in the background. Frankl, while acknowledging the present, often has a strong orientation towards the future, towards the meaning and purpose that the client can still find and live out.
Okay, let's make this concrete. Imagine our hypothetical client, a 35-year-old man, anxious, depressed, maybe drinking too much, feeling really disconnected. How would each approach look?
Right. So the regurgent therapist would focus almost entirely on building that relationship. Deep empathy, total acceptance, listening intently to his feelings of disconnection, anxiety, sadness, without judgment. The goal is to create such safety that he can start exploring his own feelings, his authentic self, trusting that he has the inner resources to find his way back to connection and well-being.
No specific advice on the drinking or the anxiety, just creating the space for him to figure it out.
Largely, yes. The healing comes from within, through the relationship.
Okay, and the Yalomian therapist with this same man.
The Yalomian therapist would likely dive into those deeper fears. What's underneath the anxiety and depression? Maybe fear of freedom, fear of making choices, fear of isolation, hence the disconnection. Maybe even unacknowledged fear of death. They'd talk directly about his sense of meaninglessness. How is he using alcohol to cope with these feelings? The therapist would challenge him to confront these realities and take responsibility for making choices that lead to a more authentic, meaningful life, even with the anxiety these choices might bring.
Much more direct, confrontational almost.
Can be. Purposefully so, sometimes. Now, Frankl's approach. The Franklian therapist, or logotherapist, would work with him to actively search for potential sources of meaning despite the anxiety and depression. What values does he hold? Are there creative pursuits he's neglected? Meaningful relationships he could invest in? Opportunities for contribution or service? They might explore how he could find meaning even in facing his struggles courageously. The focus is on identifying that why to help him reorient his goals and behaviors, reducing the need for alcohol as a crutch and alleviating the existential vacuum.
It's fascinating how different those paths are, starting from the same place. Really highlights the impact of the underlying philosophy.
Hey,
Okay, let's just quickly summarize the core pros and cons again.
sure, Rogers. Pro, the powerful optimism, fostering self-acceptance, client autonomy. Con might lack direction for some, especially in crisis.
Well,
Pro, unflinching realism, tackles core anxieties head-on, promotes responsibility. Con can be intense, potentially overwhelming or frightening.
and Frankl.
Pro harnesses the incredible power of meaning and purpose for resilience and change. Con, the emphasis on finding meaning could feel like added pressure for those already struggling.
It's really quite striking. Three distinct ways of understanding ourselves and our struggles, yet they all seem to point towards this fundamental human drive for, well, understanding ourselves and finding our place.
They really do offer complementary views, don't they? Rogers shows us the importance of the nurturing conditions for growth. Yalom forces us to confront the basic realities of our existence, and Frankl highlights just how central meaning is to navigating it all.
And looking at things like anxiety, depression, addiction through these different lenses. Rogers' incongruence, Yalom's existential dread, Frankl's existential vacuum. It just gives such a richer picture, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It moves beyond simple symptom management to asking deeper questions about how we live and what makes life feel worthwhile.
This has been incredibly illuminating. So, a final thought for you listening in. As you reflect on these three perspectives, Rogers' deep optimism, Yalom's bracing existential realism, Frankl's unwavering focus on the will to meaning, which one resonates most strongly with you? Which view of human nature and the challenges of finding purpose feels closest to your own experience? And maybe how could understanding these different viewpoints shape how you think about your own well-being, or maybe how you support others? Definitely some rich ideas to ponder.